An FBI agent must catch this con artist, but each time he finds him, the con artist is 2 steps ahead. On a rainy night in 1969, FBI agent Carl Hanratty arrives in France. After trying to communicate with the French officials, he eventually gets access to see Frank Abagnale Jr. Frank's health is in poor condition, but he still attempts to run away. He's apprehended and is to be taken back to the US in Carl's protective custody. 6 years prior, Frank lives with his parents, Frank Sr. and Paula. The couple has a beautiful love story, which Frank Sr. loves talking about. He met her in a small French town called Montréchal. Frank Sr. is a con man who has had several successes and lives affluently with Paula. However, he faces trouble as the IRS catches up with him. Frank Sr. tries asking for a loan, but no bank will help him out. He has to move his family out of their luxurious home into a shabby apartment. However, Frank Jr. loves and admires his father. Frank is enrolled into a new school where a kid bullies him for wearing his old school's uniform, saying he looks like a substitute teacher. Soon, Frank's parents are called to school by the head teacher. It turns out that Frank had been teaching French as a substitute teacher for a week. He gave out homework and went as far as arranging a road trip for the students in a parent-teacher meeting. Instead of reprimanding his son, Frank Sr. smiles at him. One day, Frank realizes that his mother is cheating on his father with Jack Barnes, his father's friend from the Rotary Club of New Rochelle. This makes him so upset as he doesn't want to see his family torn apart. Unfortunately, there's nothing he can do, and soon his parents tell him they're divorcing. Frank has to choose one parent to live with, but instead he runs away from home. Frank plans to get his family's money back so he can bring back the happiness that was once there. He tries using his father's conning techniques, but they don't work. One day, he sees a pilot accompanied by several air stewardesses. He admires the pilot's affluence and comes up with a plan. Frank approaches the airline manager, saying he's writing a school article about pilots. The manager explains that all pilots must have a license and a badge number. Frank calls the Pan Am airline asking for a uniform replacement. Soon he walks into the airport and gets mistaken for a co-pilot. He's taken to the cockpit and meets the other pilots. He's studied pilot banter, so no one doubts his sincerity. Frank learns several things regarding checks and starts cashing out the airline payroll checks. Elsewhere, FBI agent Carl learns about the forgeries. Frank is so clever that he changes the checks' routing numbers, so by the time the banks find the checks, it's too late. Carl has to educate the other agents since bank fraud is still relatively new, and most people consider it a dormant branch of the FBI. Through all his scams, Frank writes letters to his father telling him about what's happening. He also meets with him a few times, telling him to hold on as he's about to get everything he needs. One day, Frank buys his father a Cadillac, but Frank Sr. cannot accept it. The IRS is still investigating him, so seeing him with such an expensive car might cause him to get arrested. Carl's investigations lead him to a hotel where Frank has issued some of the checks. Carl informs the manager of the situation, and he discreetly mentions that Frank is staying at the hotel. Carl draws his weapon and approaches the hotel. He finds evidence of all the money-making and check-printing materials that Frank uses. The toilet flushes and Frank walks out. Carl aims his weapon at him, asking him to surrender, but Frank walks around the room touching everything. He then explains that he's a Secret Service agent called Barry Allen. He's been investigating Frank too for defrauding the government. Frank gives Carl his wallet to check for credentials. Before Carl can open the wallet, Frank shows him outside the window where someone is escorting another into the car. Frank says that it's his partner and they've arrested the culprit, but in reality, the culprit is a blind man being escorted by his aide. Carl wants to see the culprit for himself, so Frank grabs a few things as evidence and then tells Carl to wait a second. Carl goes to give Frank his ID, but he asks him to hold on to it. A few minutes later, Carl opens the wallet and realizes that he's been duped. He sees Frank running away. Frank learns from the airline manager that his shenanigans have been found out. He decides to lay low for a while. He goes to a hospital and gets the idea to be a doctor. He forges his papers, saying he studied at Harvard and worked in a children's hospital. He's hired as an ER doctor, but he has a hard time hiding the fact that blood makes him queasy. He also befriends a young nurse called Brenda, and the two start dating. One day, Carl is having coffee at a restaurant while going through the case. A waiter tells Carl that Barry Allen is a reference to The Flash. This makes Carl suspect that the culprit is a kid. He has his men look into kids who have run away from home in New York. This plan is successful as Carl learns about Frank. He visits Paula, who is now married to Barnes. Paula learns that Frank has written some bad checks and wants to pay them. However, Frank is needed for $1.3 million. Carl also visits Frank Sr., but he claims that his son joined the Marine Corps and is now on a tour. Fortunately, Carl sees the latest letter Frank has sent his father and copies the address. Meanwhile, Frank learns that Brenda is estranged from her parents. He wants to help her, so he proposes to her, realizing that her parents' minds might be swayed if Brenda comes home with a doctor. The two pack a few things and go to Brenda's house. Here, Frank says he's also a lawyer. He's pulled aside by Brenda's father, Roger. Roger wants to know who Frank really is and why he wants to marry Brenda. Frank reveals that he's neither a doctor nor a lawyer, but a kid in love with Brenda. This answer makes Roger excited, as he too is a hopeless romantic. He gives Frank his blessing to marry Brenda. He also arranges to have Frank do the Louisiana bar exam. He passes and starts working in Roger's firm. Meanwhile, Carl and his team raid Frank's address dictated in the letter, but he's long gone by then. Frank reaches out to his father saying he's getting married. Frank Sr. tells his son about Carl's visit. Frank wants to give up the line now that his life is so much better. He asks his father to tell him to stop the con, but Frank Sr. refuses, saying Frank cannot stop. Frank also learns that his mother has remarried. He walks out of the restaurant, leaving his father behind and blaming him for letting him get so deep in his crimes. Soon, Carl finds Frank's new location and comes to the engagement party. Frank sees Carl coming and escapes through the window. Before leaving, he tells Brenda the truth and asks her to meet him in 2 days at the Miami International Airport. Frank goes to the airport and sees Brenda from afar. However, he quickly realizes that Brenda is in cahoots with the FBI. This devastates him so much, but he drives away to avoid getting arrested. Frank goes to a university and hires 6 women as stewardesses for the Pan Am airline. He uses the women as a distraction and sends Carl on a wild goose chase, allowing him to leave Miami. Carl's boss wants the mission cancelled since it has cost them so much money and wielded no results. However, Carl has a breakthrough with the check paper and printer, realizing that Frank is in Montréal. He travels there and wants to bring Frank in, saying that the French police are outside. Frank has Carl swear on his daughter, but when they exit the building, Frank finds it empty. Suddenly, police cars arrive and Frank is taken into custody. As he's being driven away, Carl assures Frank that he will have him extradited to the United States. This connects us with Carl picking up Frank. As the plane they're in nears the US, Carl confesses that Frank Sr. has died. Frank sobs loudly and curses at Carl for withholding the information. He goes to the bathroom but escapes from the plane through the toilet chute. Frank goes to see his mother, hoping she still remembers the life they once had. He's disappointed to see her happy with Barnes and learns they have a daughter. The FBI arrives and Frank surrenders. Due to his escape stunt, he's tried as an adult and sentenced to 12 years in the maximum security prison. Carl often checks in on Frank. One day, he's going on a manhunt and Frank asks to see the check. He tells Carl details about the check, making it easier for the agent to arrest the man responsible. Soon, Carl brings his boss to see Frank's expertise. His boss is convinced and offers Frank a deal to serve the remainder of his sentence working for the FBI Financial Crimes Unit under Carl's custody. Frank agrees to the deal, but after some time, he gets tired of the same old routine. One day, he dresses up as a pilot, intending to resume his old habits. Carl finds him and says that he'll be back, seeing that no one is chasing him, so it's his choice. On Monday morning, Frank comes back to work. Carl wants to know how he passed the bar exam in Louisiana, and Frank reveals that he studied hard for 2 weeks and passed. The subtext shows that Frank built a successful life as one of the world's leading experts on bank fraud and forgery. He and Carl continue to be good friends.